Good evening and welcome to the Duneland Exchange Club's membership meeting. My name is Lorelei Weimer and I am currently the president of the Duneland Exchange Club. The Duneland Exchange Club is a local service club and we're about country, community, child and youth programming, and child abuse prevention. If you would like to learn more about our club, I would encourage you to go to dunelandexchangeclub.com. Tonight, we are looking forward to hearing from Kristen Patton, who is a licensed psychotherapist and is the owner of Life Point Child and Family Therapy. Kristen will be speaking to us about kids, trauma, and child abuse prevention and integration. So please welcome Kristen.
So, Kristen Patton, that's my name. You can call me Kristen. As Lorelei said, part of what I'm going to start out with, though, is a little bit of therapist humor. You can see in this little picture, we've got parents that have their little eggs with such anticipation, and they're already taking what I equate to like your pregnancy photos of the little eggs, and you've got one parent saying to the other, "I'm returning your Christmas gifts. We might as well save our money for the therapy they'll need once they've hatched." And I don't know, I think that's hilarious because our kids, you're kind of as parents thinking, what are they going to need therapy on, And so I think that's hilarious. Every time I share that joke, no one thinks it's as funny as I do, but it is. So one of the things I'm going to start with is, and I would encourage you, like, it's hard for me to not hear any feedback. If your house is quiet, you can unmute yourself and respond. It helps me to just know people are like still there. I can see your faces, but if your house is quiet, you can feel free. So I'm going to put this in here just so that you guys can implant this in your head as I'm chatting, that there are two main emotional needs that kids have, which is to feel significant and accepted. And I want you to just remember that because there's going to be a quiz later. And so before we jump into some of those other things, I'm just going to share a little bit about my family and where I come from, a little bit of background. This is my family now. So this is my husband, Frank, and we've been together for 13 years. I've got 4 kids, 5, 8, 15, and 18. We're a blended family, 2 steps, 2 naturals. We're one big, mostly happy family. But when I was little, probably around 15 or so, I had a close friend who wanted to be at my house instead of her house. And when I would go to her house, the vibe was very different. There was a lot of stress and arguing, and it didn't feel the same as my house. And that planted that first seed of really wanting to be a marriage therapist, because I thought there's got to be a way to help her parents get along better. Like, I know that this is possible. So, you take a few detours in your career path. So by the second year of college, I had changed my major to psychology. And as much as I wanted to be a marriage therapist initially, you know how life kind of works. It's like you get interested in the areas where you have experience. And so you go to the internship that you could land. So that's kind of that's why I landed at the places that I landed. Because my first experience was actually in therapy as I was an intern in a domestic violence group, and learned very quickly about how charming it was guys in this particular group. There were no females in this group. And then I also worked with adults who have sexual offenses on their record. And actually, while I was waiting to get my license, I worked at a place where I met my husband, and we were both line staff for juveniles with sexual behavior problems living in the residential facility. The stories I could tell about that place, you can ask me later if you're interested. So kind of did that first, and then worked at a local community agency with kids that have been in foster care and were also in trouble for inappropriate touching as youth. And then we did treatment with these guys individually and in group. until they were off probation. So that was with juveniles. And then at the same time, also working with victims who were in foster care of sexual abuse. So typically their program for the juveniles with sexual offenses on their records, it would take about 18 months to 3 years to complete that program. And then I was able to be part of I guess it was kind of a pilot group, but it's a grant through the same agency, but it was called the Healing Path. And it was actually a really great opportunity to be part of. We collected data and we partnered with Northwestern University to be one of the folks that said whether ARC, it stands for attachment, self-regulation, and competency, whether that particular therapy was going to be evidence-based. And so really got to be part of that grant from the National NCTSN, National Child Traumatic Stress Network. We got the grant from them. And so worked in that for a couple years. And you know how agencies work that you're kind of underpaid and overworked, and I was missing my kids' lives. And so then I moved to working at the Cancer Treatment Center of America, where I was a mind-body therapist for a couple of years until I went into kind of part-time, going into private practice, and then full-time just in 2016. I went back to working with kids for a couple reasons. One, adults tend to like to dwell on the negative things, and kids like to avoid it. And so working with kids is just a lot of fun. I love being able to play and those kinds of things, but on top of it, you know, kids, the work really is helping them face the things that are hard to face. And so I really found that after working with adults at the cancer hospital that I missed working with kids. So when I opened the private practice, it really was to work with kids. And especially since I had the training in this ARC model, we work a lot with parents and families. And so the third reason is that kids are so impressionable. And I know that you guys really stand for, you know, and put a lot of backing in abuse prevention and things like that. But that was my heart as well, is my heart, because there are so many things that you can do preventatively if you're able to get into their world and their family system at a young age. And so that felt kind of exponentially rewarding and could prevent lots of future negative impacts, those of which hopefully I don't see, right? But of course you hear the terrible stories on the news and things like that. And so we go for preventing those things. So in recent years, I finally added marriage and couples counseling to my repertoire, mainly just because it was a natural progression. Kids are stressed when parents are stressed. So helping decrease stress for a marriage makes a lot of sense for a kid and for the family system. And so in our practice now, there are 6 therapists, 3 admin, and we're unfortunately, because of the pandemic, growing like crazy because there's just so much dysregulation and unknown with this pandemic. It's really turned kids' lives, especially the ones that were already struggling, it's sort of put a bigger gap for them. So business-wise is good, but on the other side, I've always said I want to work myself out of a job because that would mean everyone is doing okay. But I don't think I'll have to worry about that anytime soon. So really quickly, just because it's interesting, when I worked with guys with sexual offenses on their records, some of the things that I learned that I sort of had to demythify, if that's a word, was that adult sex offenders were not necessarily sexually abused themselves. They can seem like your neighbor next door. It really depends on the person. Some of them were teachers and I mean, they obviously weren't teaching by the time they were in therapy. One of the things that I was always looking for themes, what created this, right? What creates a perpetrator? And they all watched pornography and groomed their victims, many of which were children. So it was really interesting to get into the nooks and crannies of how their brains function, and then be able to work with victims. It's a good, well-rounded experience. I will say that, because part of what I got to see was the humanity of guys that have sexual offenses on their record. It really matters how the court dealt with them in terms of what title they got, and they're shunned by society in lots of ways, but you hear their story and I only had compassion for them. They struggle with things like shame and liking themselves and figuring out, how do I make amends for this terrible thing? The ones I'm scared of are the ones that aren't in therapy. Those are the ones that are actually much more, a little scarier. So the difference between, so I worked with adults and youth. When you're working with adolescents, their sexuality is so formable at that age. And so it's very, very different. It's not so much about deviance and what, I won't go into what we would qualify as deviance, but you can sort of imagine what deviance would look like in an adult. We don't call it deviant in youth because most of the time it's about lack of boundaries and opportunity, which is why you see a lot of incestual relationships and, with cousins or close neighbors, friends. It's about, it really is about opportunity. So those, and really teaching healthy boundaries, healthy relationships. With adults, you focus more on how they groomed their victims and their story, whereas with youth, you focus on what's the healthy way we should be seeing women. We should be seeing men, not over sexualizing things, healthy relationships. How do you develop a healthy relationship, beginning to end? So just kind of interesting points of, I guess, education that I learned in those early years, but I wanted to focus a little bit more on the work that I've done recently. So most therapies and reasons for attending therapy, they tend to stem from some level of trauma. So, or we'll call it the stress response. So I kind of want to spend a couple minutes just making sure we're on the same page in terms of what I view as trauma. I'm actually just going to read this because I think it's the most poignant, and that's why I put it on the slide. Many different things may be called traumatic. Trauma refers to experiences that are overwhelming and may leave a person feeling helpless, vulnerable, or very frightened. So you can actually have a bus that goes into the water and filled with children, and the ones which would be traumatic in general, but the ones who were able to help the younger kids get out, they felt like they had more power and they had a role. And so they're less likely to be affected by that trauma than the ones that were completely helpless and younger and didn't have a role. So it is about how the person perceives it and how they experienced it. Trauma may include specific types of events, such as being in an accident or experience a natural disaster like a hurricane or earthquake. Trauma may also include ongoing stressors, such as physical or sexual abuse. So in our practice, we tend to see what we'll call dysregulation, which we'll talk about how there's a stem of where the dysregulation comes from, that is similar to a trauma response. For kids, trauma is often about more than physical harm. For instance, separation from a caregiver, emotional neglect, lack of stable home, like foster care. Those can be very traumatic. I think neglect is very hard to treat because it's a lack of something. When someone gets punched in the face, they know that they got hurt, you know. That's also tricky with sexual abuse because it doesn't necessarily hurt. It might actually feel good. And so sexual abuse isn't one that kids may necessarily know isn't okay. And then there's a distinction between acute trauma and chronic stress, or what we'll also call in our field complex trauma or developmental trauma. So when you think about the difference, if you think about a soldier who goes off to war, that's an acute trauma, and he comes back and he might have PTSD from that. When you have an ongoing stressor and you have developmental trauma, what ends up happening is there are gaps in your development because of your experience as you're growing. Now, this is very hard to read, so I actually blew up a little bit of it. So here's one example. If I am a first grader and I have physical abuse happening at the home, and the night before mom and dad got violent, and then I go to school the next day and I'm supposed to go onto the playground and play with my friends, but I don't feel like it because I'm just making sure that someone's not going to punch me, right? It puts them into a different mentality. So attachment and relationships get affected. They have relationship problems with friends, problems with attachment and separation from caregivers, problems with boundaries. I'm sure, I mean, Lorelai has seen a lot of this in daycares, and I'm sure lots of daycares see this where they don't quite know why the child is doing this, but they see the it's not typical. So then they'll isolate themselves. They could have difficulty attuning to other people. So these are just examples of things that can happen if they're having a trauma, and then it develops these gaps in several areas. So another area is thinking and learning, right? So math builds on itself. So if I'm checked out because I'm thinking about this thing at home and I miss 2 + 2, it's going to really be hard to subtract because I don't know how to add, and I missed that. So then it puts more of a gap. Are you tracking with me? Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Awesome.
So one of the things that I want to do a quick science or neurology lesson to understand how we get to fear and developmental trauma. So I want to talk about the fight, flight, freeze response. So does anyone know where that response comes from and when we tend to have it?
Well, if something's happening to you, right? If somebody's going to attack you, you're going to get into this fight. I'm going to fight because something's happening to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or you might choose to run away and get away from the situation.
Yes. Yep.
So is there a certain part of your brain that helps you decide that?
There is.
Okay.
So that fight, flight, freeze response is very much helpful to keep us alive, right? So back in caveman days, if a panther was gonna, attack the village, the warriors would stand outside and they would literally, if they, heard something, it triggered this thing inside of them. It's actually your amygdala. It's this small thing in the center of your brain. It's so tiny, but it has so much power. And it's to assess danger. So this is our typical stress reaction. Okay. It is a reaction. It's very instinctual. It's not, oh, a car's coming at me. I'm going to think should I go left or right? Oh, the grass is greener over here. Oh, but no, you're just jumping. You're out of the way. Right. So it's actually supposed to work this way, where if you see this, if you're walking through the forest, right? And all of a sudden you see a snake. Okay, now this is a green snake, so maybe that doesn't instill fear automatically, but I don't know whether a green snake has poison or not, so I would be scared. And my body is going to say, it's going to choose for me that I am, that I could outrun a snake. So I'm probably going to run away. Now, if that was a bear, my body knows that I can't fight a bear and I probably can't outrun the bear unless I had, you know, some sort of weapon, right? So your body chooses the thing that helps you stay alive, and it chooses pretty quickly. And then once you are out of danger, so once I've run away from that snake, then my body will actually calm down, and I will not get that. I will be, in this drawing, it talks about how, you know, your alarm system goes off in the amygdala, and then I can't even read the thing myself. Your hippocampus is the filing center, and then your thinking center is the prefrontal cortex. And once the alarm has gone off and you're in a safe place, your body calms down and all of those things are back online. And it's supposed to function so that you get the alarm, your body says, woo, woo, danger, danger, Will Robinson. And then you figure out what you're supposed to do, get out of danger, and then it calms down. That's what's supposed to happen. And what I'm going to show you here is this is actually how our parasympathetic system and our sympathetic system respond during fight, flight, and then freeze. If you look at this, social engagement is the green. It's at the bottom. That's kind of like homeostasis. That's where we're at. That's the calm place. That's the place where we have joy and we're in the present moment and we're grounded and we have compassion and we're mindful. And if you can, actually, I'm going to go to this next slide. It's very blurry, but I tried to blow it up so we could at least see it. What happens inside your body when you're in that social engagement place is that your digestion increases. You have resistance to infection. You have an immune response, rest, recuperation, circulation to non-vital organs. These are all good things, right? This is what happens when our body is in a calm place. So if you remember this, when you go up into fight flight, your sympathetic system kicks in. So it basically is giving you the energy to fight or run. So it's a physical thing. So it will literally increase your blood pressure. Your heart rate will go up. It gives you fuel. You'll get cortisol and adrenaline, and oxygen circulates. You know, it actually will decrease your insulin activity and digestion and salivation and your immune response. So, I mean, those are things that would be okay if it, because your body is putting all the energy towards this thing to stay alive. Okay. So when we have activated then the freeze mode, that's one step higher. Okay. So this is actually your dorsal vagal, which you don't really need to remember that. You just need to remember that it's more severe than your fight flight response. It's the thing that happens right before you die. So literally your endorphins, they are numb and your pain threshold goes up very high. Your heart rate actually decreases at this point, because it's kind of like if you imagine that antelope that is trying to outrun the cougar, and at some point the antelope says, I'm so tired, I can't keep running, and the cougar's got all this energy. And literally, if you watch the National Geographic Channel, the antelope turns around, sits down, and prepares for death. He prepares to be eaten. And that's the freeze response. So your body actually goes into, this is what actually happens internally. So your immune system decreases, your social behavior, that's like a thing of the past. Sexual responses decrease. all of these things. So you have all had this happen. Okay. If you just think about a stressful event that's happened in your life, it can be a small stress or a big stress, but you can probably, if you tune into your body, notice that your body did something right inside. So this is how our stress response is supposed to work in a helpful way to keep us alive. Okay. What tends to happen, and this is the difference between acute stress and chronic stress, is that you are in that state of stress so often that your filing center starts to misfile dangerous things and put it in the non-dangerous category, or non-dangerous things and put it in the dangerous category. So, I mean, you could literally have a child sitting at the desk and the teacher takes the pencil off his desk, and that triggers something from before, and his body reacts as if he's about to die. So he just shuts down, completely shuts down. And the teacher's sitting there like, what just happened here? And they're very confused. But anyone who felt like they were about to die would have shut down as well. So it remains true that that's their experience if they've had some sort of trauma. And if we take our snake image, it's the concept that if I walk to school every single day for 20 days and I see a snake, and then on day 21, I see a stuffed animal that looks like a snake or a stick that looks like a snake, my body is literally going to give me the same adrenaline, the same cortisol that it gave me those other 20 days. And it's going to put the stick in the dangerous category. And so this is where we see on a minor level, a lot of anxiety in kids. So because kids are in general, well, adults also, we are in a fear state or a loving state. So we're either in that fight, flight, freeze or the social engagement. And it's just a matter of how extreme are we interpreting the thing, right? So I just want to kind of apply this to our great big science experiment that we're recently in called the pandemic. What have you guys seen as sort of fear or panic behavior or thinking during this pandemic?
Fear that somebody in your family is going to get sick and die.
Mm-hmm. And if we have a fear that someone's going to get sick and die, what might our action be?
Well, just stay away from them, or in our case, just try to stay as safe as possible and, do what we need to do to keep them safe.
Yeah.
Or sometimes I think, did I forget to wash my hands? I mean, there's been some things where I've thought, oh my gosh, I didn't wash my hands, or I didn't put a hand sanitizer on it. Oh my gosh, am I going to get it now? Like I made one mistake, and could that mistake be costly?
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is in the pandemic, just like we've had time to plan for like tornadoes, but over the time of the last year, we've learned more about the coronavirus, and we've learned what is actually safe and unsafe. We didn't have the science before to even know how to respond. So there is a difference between reacting, which is what we're going to call the fear or the stress response, and then responding with good thought out knowledge that is informed by our fear, but is not reacting from fear. So there is a difference. So when we have a loved one that was exposed to corona, for example, we're going to follow the science and respond. That doesn't mean that we need to stay holed up in our house every single day. It might for someone who's immunocompromised. That would be the safest thing. That's actually how the kings back in the day, when they had the Spanish flu, they would protect them. They literally just blocked them into a room for all those years. And so you're responding with the facts that we have and the information, and the science is just coming out about corona, right? Same thing for tornadoes. We know how to prepare for them. And I've got a lot of students that are scared of tornadoes. So we talk about how the alarm goes off every Tuesday of the month just to test it, to see if it's working. And if it's going off on a different day other than 10 o'clock on the first Tuesday of the month, then that means that there has been a tornado. There's the perfect conditions for a tornado. But outside of that, we don't need to worry about the tornado unless it's there, and then we know what to do, right? So that helps decrease the anxiety. We want to try to stay in a response mode, not a reaction mode. And one of the things that when we're looking at, during the pandemic, when there's a lot of times of uncertainty and some fear based on just survival, we want to understand kid behavior, and we may see more dysregulation and temper tantrums or acting out or ignoring behavior during this season. I mean, it would make sense. I'm sure you guys have seen that in your kids and grandkids and neighbors and all of that, let alone us, right?
Right.
High functioning adults, right? I mean,
Right. Oh yeah.
It's pushed all of us. So I want to tie this all together. Why does physical child abuse occur? Throw out some reasons.
Alcohol abuse, so some kind of substance abuse.
Okay.
That's what I thought of. That was the first thing that came to my mind.
Yep.
Anger issues.
Yep. And why would someone be using a substance in the first place?
They're trying to cope with trauma that they've experienced, and they don't know how to cope with that trauma themselves.
Yeah, they're picking a coping strategy that hurts themselves and others, right? What about sexual abuse?
They're trying to cope with trauma that they don't know how to cope with themselves, I guess.
It's much more complicated, I'll give you that. But many times it comes from malformation or development or misguidance from trauma. Lots of times from their own childhood and their experience with their parents. When I think of physical abuse, a lot of that comes from the parents' inability to manage their own emotions. So I put this slide up because I love this phrase. Controlling your child's behavior is not indicative of good parenting. Regulating your own behavior despite your child is.
That's good.
I love this because this is the crux of what we do. And I think that this prevents child abuse. I think that this prevents sexual perpetrators from even being formed, because we're working not only with the child, but with the parents to help them manage their own emotional response to things. So let's go back to those two core needs. Does anyone remember what they were?
Oh shoot.
There'd be a quiz.
Acceptance
Except, yep.
and
Feel significant, feel satisfied.
Oh, did you write it down, because I was going to.
Of course I did.
Of course I did.
You smart.
So to feel significant and to feel accepted, you can trace almost all kid behavior back to those two core needs. So I'm going to give an example. This is my then 3-year-old, and you can see the mess that she has made. That was not the only time that she has made this mess. So on the left is the first time it happened, and my body went into a higher stress reaction. Okay. I was frustrated. I was confused. Why is she doing that? Now I have to clean this all up. Is something wrong with her? None of my other kids did this. Like, I mean, she seriously made tons of messes. Now, so the first time was this reaction mode. Now, the second picture on the right was not the second time she did it, because it was probably the 15th time. And by that time, I had learned. And as a parent, I had then like analyzed the situation, to be the child of a therapist. But I had had time to process, and I could respond as a parent to her emotional needs rather than react out of my own frustration, because it was going to cause me more work, basically, right? Or it comes down to, I'm scared that I'm not a good enough parent, that I have well enough to not throw things on the ground, right? Well, I knew that her kid behavior was about feeling significant and accepted. And when I kept my voice calm, she didn't feel rejected. So that's the first win. So that would be the opposite of acceptance, right? So she would feel accepted. Then when I realized that actually this was her way of feeling like she had power in a family of 4 kids where she's the youngest and she had to do extreme things to get our attention. And it worked. But then I started giving her kinesthetic things to play with, like water beads. And I would play with her so that I would meet that need for significance. She had power and could manipulate the water beads rather than the Cheerios, or what, I don't even know what those are, Kicks maybe, combination of 5 different cereals. And she could manipulate something and have my attention. So as a parent, I had win number 2 and win number 3 because it met her emotional needs. And that's the difference between reacting and responding, right? We've all done both. I would venture to guess as parents, we're all going to have done both.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. But I had to be calm in order to even come to those conclusions. Right.
Right.
So this is just a small example of, understanding kids and how to respond. And I could be here all night talking more about what really helps kids in terms of interventions and things that we should be doing to teach emotional education and things like that. But really at the base, if we don't understand that their tantrums come from this lower brain kind of response or reaction, then we're not going to problem solve in the right direction, because we mainly need to help them feel accepted and loved and calm them down so that we can then have a conversation like, oh, okay, you made a mess, let's clean it up, right? That's a very reasonable thought, but in that moment, maybe one or both of us are not in a reasonable state. We are in emotion mind or fear mind. And so this, the slide here on the right talks about the amygdala, and this particular thing refers to it as the upper brain and the lower brain. So upper brain tantrums are an intellectual attempt to manipulate, and lower brain tantrums occur when kids aren't able to access their higher thinking processes. So you're not going to be able to talk a kid out of a lower brain tantrum because they can't access that. Literally, the thing that connects your left and right hemispheres, called the corpus callosum, the MRIs and the imaging shows that when you go over a 7 out of 10 on emotions, it stops communicating to your reasonable mind. And it's amazing to me. So the first thing we have to do is actually calm them down and make them feel safe. And in order to do that, we have to be calm and we have to be able to put ourselves in a safe place. And that's the thing that will then help prevent a lot of the child abuse that happens. And we see parents that probably aren't on the abusive side, but they're just having a hard time teaching their kids how to regulate emotionally. And so we'll work with them on what things sort of make sense. And it's still the same treatment. Help them feel safe. And we teach them the same things we would teach someone who's been physically abused or sexually abused, because it's part of what helps kids in general. So are you tracking with me? Did I lose anyone?
Excuse me,
Yeah.
would you go back to the slide that had the controlling your child's behavior?
Let's see. This one?
That one.
Yes. Yeah. It's a good,
It's a good one to write down. I bet he's writing that down too. Smart.
yeah, I can also send you copies of the slides if you want.
That'd be
you.
great if we can get a copy of those.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
no
Thank
problem.
you.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay, cool. So I know it's a lot of information. Whew, take a deep breath. I do want to leave time for questions and answers, but really just wanted to throw out a few ideas for finding a counselor if you're making referrals or interested in helping folks in your community. Because I'm not in your community, I don't have a ton of connections, right? So in general, you want to encourage them to check their insurance for behavioral health coverage. Some employers carve out mental health and they give it to a different provider. And so you really have to be informed client in order to so that you don't show up and then they say, oh, well, we are covered by Blue Cross, but you have a carve out for Aetna. You have to pay out of pocket. So it's a good question to ask. And then I encourage folks to use Psychology Today. Most therapists I know are listed on there. You can sort by region, by type of therapy, by type of insurance. It's a great tool. So psychologytoday.com. And then I use Google Maps or just a general Google search for something like counseling near me or psychotherapist near me or child counselor near me or grief counseling, bereavement. Most therapists know how to market to that. And so they should come up in a Google search. I listed a few questions to also ask. I don't need to read all those here, but I'll send them in the slides so that you guys can do with them as you will. I think it's helpful to ask. Sometimes I hear from parents, I don't even know what to ask. I don't even know what to look for. And so that's why I ask, put those questions down there because you really want someone that has enough experience. And so you want to ask if they have between 5 and 10 years of experience. Otherwise, they're still learning themselves. Depending on the level of severity, it might be okay to have a newer therapist, but especially if you've gone through a couple therapists, you really want to ask for someone who's got the experience. So
That's good information to share with the public, and not that we would send it to I wouldn't send it maybe to anybody specifically, but it would be a great thing like to post on the Exchange Club page, just as great information for people that need to know that kind of thing.
yeah, I saw on your website, you guys have some great information on there. I really liked your website.
Thank you to Lorelei.
Good job, Lorelei. Yeah.
So But Kristen, how do you know a good counselor from not a good counselor? You know, because you do hear the stories where people have gone to a counselor and they weren't that good. So how do you determine that somebody is good and you're not going to get into a worse issue because they didn't handle a child properly?
You know, the best answer that I can say to that is in the first 2 sessions, if your gut response says this isn't a good match, then change and stick with it until you find someone that you have a good feeling about. Because I am a big proponent of that gut response, because it is about a match. You know, there may be, I've got a lot of, I'll say, young therapists on my team, and the kids love them. They are just so fun and energetic, and it's a great match. And so it depends. So that's what I would say. The first couple sessions, pay attention to how it feels to be in the room. If it feels like it's herky jerky, maybe the therapist is having an off day. So I say like 2 or 3 sessions, but don't give more of your time if you feel like after 2 or 3 sessions, it's really not a good match, because sometimes people stay with it too long and it really just isn't a good match. And then, I mean, putting that into words, I think it depends on what type of therapy you're looking for. So if you want a kid therapist, I would be able to help you, you know, someone who talks to the kid, who makes the kid feel important and has some sort of connection with the parents and involves the parents. Those would be the folks I would be looking for. But in general, it's hard to say what makes a good therapist, because it's going to be different for you and me and, you know, Tammy over here. So I know that's not a great answer, but yet that's that's the best one.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, sir, you have your hand up. I don't know your name. What's your name?
Mac,
Mac. Okay. Did you have a question?
yeah, are there certain credentials you should look for that show more extensive experience than just the regular psychotherapist?
Yeah, so there's different levels of credentials. You have your master's levels, which are licensed clinical professional counselor, licensed clinical social worker, and then you have your marriage and family therapist. And then you have your doctoral level, which is a PsyD. So those initials are PSY and then D, or a PhD. And those are folks that you would refer to as a psychologist versus a therapist. So there are folks, I have a couple on my team that are like LPCs. In Illinois, it's kind of like your residency. You sit for your exam and you're licensed, but then you have 2 to 3 years of experience, and then you sit for another exam, and then you get your LCPC. I don't know exactly how it is in Indiana, but I know that's how it is in most states, but just maybe with different letters. I also like to look for specific, so like if you look at their website, they may have like an extra EMDR or a, you know, CADC, or there are different, like if they're a drug and alcohol addiction specialist, they will have gone through a particular training. Folks that have been around a while have sometimes accumulated several of those types of trainings and certifications. And so, you know, but I've also found folks that, you know, with not the credentials, were a great match for folks. And so, you know, but I personally would look for the higher credentials, at least your second level of licensing or a doctorate.
Kristen, with sexual abuse folks that have been sexually abusing children, you kind of often hear that they're very difficult to cure from that. Is that true?
So like the perpetrators?
Yes.
I think it's kind of like when you imagine alcohol addiction. They're probably going to struggle with that. And I will say, it depends on the level of severity. So someone, I saw a gentleman that had statutory rape. So there was 2 years between him and the person, and it was consensual, but he got listed as a predatory sex offender for life.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so you see something like that, and honestly, when you work with him, that was just not the case. It wasn't going to be something he struggled with for the rest of his life. And then on the other hand, you have a 75-year-old who literally can't pass his polygraph because he's got so many offenses that he can't name them all. And that's going to be someone who struggles. And bless his heart, he was still working at it and wanting to change, and was getting the support. And someone like that should not, I don't think he really ever graduated from therapy per se. It was just going to be ongoing support. So
Like you said, with an alcoholic, they always say they're never cured, they're recovering.
Yeah. And the person gets to identify as such. So, you don't get to come up to someone and call them fill in the blank, like even queer or the new names they're coming out. They
Right.
self-identify as that. So they'll call themselves a recovering alcoholic, or they'll say, I am an alcoholic, even if they're 20 years in sober. You kind of want to go with what they're going to call it. Sexual things, they tend to not talk about as much.
I bet.
It's more taboo. And lots of folks are scared of it because they don't know the ins and outs. And I'm very grateful for my experience, because now I at least know the ins and outs of what to assess and what would be dangerous, right? So you can actually, obviously with anyone with those struggles, you want to keep your kids safe. But it won't hurt to have a friendship with them. Some people just
Right.
stay away totally, and that's also not what they need. It actually would perpetuate their shame, and they actually need friends. They need people to care for them despite what they've done. That's actually
tough. That would be tough. Because like you said, it is such a taboo. It's hard to have any kind of sympathy or empathy for somebody who's done things like that. But obviously, like you said, they have to have it because they're human beings.
And probably somewhere along the way, it got disrupted, that love and compassion, where they didn't feel it from where they should have felt it. And so they were searching for it in the wrong place. And at some point when you're an adult, you definitely know that's wrong. So I'm not trying to justify any of that behavior. And we want to support those folks in our community because they're living among us, and they struggle too.
Yeah.
So are there resources, and I'm sorry if I missed this, Kristen, but are there resources for those adults? Because we are always advocating and looking right at the children. And what can we do to kind of be this barrier between those perpetrators and the children? But are there resources that we can share as a group for adults that are still struggling with their own trauma and past trauma that is leading them to, maybe they haven't done anything, but maybe they do have some sort of thoughts that are that could be detrimental to themselves and to our youth? Are there resources, websites, or anything that you could share with us that maybe could come later, or that you could share with Lorelei, so that we could pass them on to adults that are still struggling with thoughts that are obviously unpure and, I guess I don't have another word for it, but
No,
so that we could help those adults as well too, because if we're helping to advocate for them, oh, baby, sorry, sorry. If we're helping to then advocate for them, then in turn, we're also helping advocate for the children around them,
absolutely.
which, you know, I think is very important. And I've never thought until you've spoken with us today, honestly, to look at the adults and say, okay, so how can we also help them?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll definitely give some ideas. I think in general, it depends on if it's already a problem or not. So there are going to be folks that are part of what we call the Sex Offender Management Board, and they've been trained and certified to give treatment to guys that have sexual behavior problems. And that would be a good person, even if you don't have an offense on your record, that would still be a good person to get therapy from. But if you are but if you're struggling with other pieces and it's not necessarily an identified significant sexual behavior acting out and it's trauma, there are like self-identified therapists that say we are trauma trained. So when you do your little Google search, you want to say trauma informed therapist.
Okay. Right. That makes sense. I think that a strange positive that might come out of the pandemic is that because so many people are able to see therapists and doctors and so on virtually, is if we're able to share some resources for people that are otherwise really afraid to go and say, I have these strange detrimental thoughts and behaviors, that maybe they would be more likely to reach out virtually and instead of sitting face to face with somebody, but sitting face to face like we are, to, you know, sit with somebody and say, to admit, I guess, that they have thoughts or that something inside of them is dark or toxic or whatever it may be. This might be the light in the pandemic, is that I'm never going to bring myself to a counselor if I feel that I have some sort of need or want or desire to hurt or to traumatize or to affect somebody else, especially a child. But if resources are available now during the pandemic, that it might just be kind of a strange silver lining to say that those people that otherwise would not have brought themselves to the doctor might now, because they feel less embarrassed or grossed out or sick or anything that they might feel, to get themselves help during time. It might be a little bit easier if it's just for one, then that's a good thing. So any of those resources are
looking
welcome.
for things that would break down the barrier between getting help and stigma. And as much as mental health has made a lot of progress in the last 30, 50 years, it still has a stigma, right? And so anything that will break down the barrier, that gets someone to reach out for support, we're always looking for those things. So I think
absolutely, because if we're advocating for the child, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I did. I apologize. But if we're advocating for the child and then that child turns 18 or 19 or 20 or 25 or 27, and they didn't get the help that they needed as a child, then there has to be something else that pushes them and resources that are available to them, because that means they are a neglected, abused child that needed help and they didn't get it when they were that age. And not to advocate, but they can't always be a disgusting human being. They could be just a child that didn't get help. And so if there's something that we can push to help them, then I think that really will move forward in our MO, which is of course to then in turn help the children. So
absolutely. I think that's a great point, that a scared child is a child that acts out, right? A hurt child is a child that acts out, and those children turn into adults.
Right.
And it's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Kristen, if you had the top 5 things you you would want to impress upon parents that you're like, if they did these 5 things, so their household would be so much better in terms of, raising a child and stuff. What would be those top 5 things?
Oh gosh. So I probably have like a top 50. But when you think, I would actually narrow a lot of it down to a top 2 maybe. Because when you think about what builds regulation in children is actually, I mean, like there's an infant on the call tonight. When an infant cries and you come to them and you meet their need, they receive the message, this adult cares for me and is trustworthy. And that builds regulation. You can watch a ton of these studies where a child literally, if the mom is like, da, 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 and singing to them, the child is engaged and regulated, and they're organized in their behavior. And then if the parent just stares, the child is trying to get her attention. And then all of a sudden, within 15 seconds, the infant is crying because it's dysregulated. So the things that we do with infants, and we call it attachment. We call it attachment in our field. And when you attach when the child attaches to you and you bond to the child in a way that helps, it does help regulate them. And you follow that throughout their entire development. But it changes from infancy to toddlerhood to, grade school to teenagers. Oh, I've got 2 teens right now. They're really testing my skills. And so attachment is the foundation that it's the difference between a kid that will be in 2 inches of water with floaties on and a life jacket and be like, I'm so scared. And then the kid that jumps into the deep end because they know that the parent will be there to catch them. Like that's what secure attachment and insecure attachment looks like. So that would be the first thing. But then the second thing I would say is teach them emotions, teach them about their body, teach them sensations, that this butterfly feeling inside of your tummy might mean that you're nervous. And that emotion is simply true. And then the thought process is actually naming the feeling. That, and using feelings in the house. So talking to them about the actual feeling, because a lot of our relationships, they function on the emotional level, but we don't talk about emotions. They don't teach it in school. They're getting better at it. I will say that, a lot better at it, but that's where a lot of the actual issues are occurring. They say that in any conflict, there's 3 things going on. And so it's not just the topic, it's not the thing at hand. And when you teach them young, then they are more likely to use that verbiage and it just becomes normal. And identifying feelings, number 1 thing we do with kids and families.
So you got it down from 50 to 2.
To 2. I'm going with 2.
Well, one of the things I talked to Kristen when I talked to her to come and speak with us tonight is talking about maybe that our club does sponsor a webinar, and maybe it's an hour and a half of Kristen talking about the critical things that parents need to do, because it sounds like it does come down to parenting. You keep saying that the kids didn't feel secure or they didn't feel appreciated. It seems like everything comes down to how were they raised, and if they're in a conflict home with a lot of conflict, it's carrying through their whole life.
Yeah, it's my bias. That's my belief. I've seen it happen over and over, and I'm totally willing to support. That's part of why I do a lot of teaching at moms groups and schools in our area, because parents haven't necessarily heard this side of things. And so, yeah, I'm all for that.
Well, and I think a lot of people have children and they just, to be honest with you, a lot of parents wing it. I mean,
yeah, they do their default mode, which is what their parents did, or they do the opposite because they didn't like it. And it's not necessarily the most helpful thing.
Exactly. Before we let Kristen go, though, is there any other questions or comments that anyone has? I can't see people, so I don't. Let's see if I get.
I'll tell you, my comment came early on. I always had heard that most sexual offenders have been sexually abused themselves.
Mhm.
And it does surprise me to hear that that's really, I mean, I'm sure it's true in some cases, but it's not across the board.
It's not. That's why I put that in there, because that was my most surprising fact working with, because I had thought that, I really had, and
Absolutely.
it's not true at all. So,
And I was right there with you, Pam. Without question, I knew that they all were sexually abused at some point, and they wanted to do it to someone else because it happened
Yeah.
to them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's true. We mainly see that with teens, and we call it sexual reactivity. So they will act out the exact thing that was done to them. But it has a particular name, and it's not necessarily true for all the folks. And even with teens, especially, it's not true. It's really about opportunity, sexual urge, and lack of boundaries. And you put those things together, and you have a budding sex offender.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we let Kristen go for tonight?
Well, I don't have a question, but I was just going to say the same thing that my mom had said and that Lorelai had agreed with is not only did you share really pertinent information with us that I thought I knew as a middle school teacher and as somebody who has been in the Exchange Club for a while. Of course, I know I'm not an expert, but I just really did want to thank you for coming, because I feel like not only was your presentation super informative, but we can tell that you care. And having you here was really, really, really a breath of fresh air and a different way to present information, especially in regards to not only sexual health, but sexual abuse and children and trauma. And I appreciate you being here. And I just wanted to say that I think you were a little breath of fresh air. And so we appreciate you very much.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
Well, thank you, Emily. That's very nice. And
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
Kristen, I mean, this was, I could listen to you for hours because it's just so
Yeah.
much, it's just a whole world that I don't know. And I think there's just
Right.
and I think a lot of it is we are ignorant in a lot of the things that we do.
Mhm.
Any other questions before we let Kristen go and probably have dinner and spend time with her family?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Mac.
The society today and the young people today, the parenting skills, in listening to you, the educational process that is evolving, I do not see that much of a positive coming out of the youth of today.
Yeah.
I've only been around 8 decades, so
Just a
I'm
few.
just particularly, well, I'm saddened by what's transpiring today. So with the COVID and the quote unquote racism activity going on today, the violence, what skills are the youth really acquiring and how to deal with anger issues or sexual issues? Or, you know, I can go back and blame the flower children of the 60s because I was a part of that culture at the time. But I don't know. It just, I'm more concerned with our grandchildren, but I know I really don't have that much of a sway over them. But you know, that's, I don't know about tomorrow. And I'm in a place where there's not much I can really do about it. But that's
I mean,
that's my,
I am totally on board with you. While I haven't been around 8 decades, wow, that's awesome. I am also concerned to the point that sometimes it keeps me up at night about what's going on with the amount of technology and information that kids are able to have. As a mom of 2 teenage boys, being able to keep them from seeing pornography, I literally think it's impossible if you want to give them any form of technology, which is some sort of connection. I have all the millions of filters in place, and I haven't been able to completely eliminate that. And then on top of that, we've got all of the just screen addiction, right? I mean, I've got kids that'll throw tantrums just because they have to get off of the screen. And so while it's kind of fun sometimes to figure out where it comes from and where to place blame, I think the more helpful thing is to figure out, how do we put in place things that support this generation? What are they missing? And they're missing social interaction. They're missing how to go up and meet new friends in person. There's a lot of kids who struggle with that and social anxiety because they're on their screen so much. It literally does not happen like it used to. And then there are other things that I think are, well, I'll just say, I think it's helpful to focus on the things we can do. And when you've got grandkids, you can have an impact by teaching them the things that you've learned in those 8 decades, the things that you feel like they should know. Don't give up on them, and train them, teach them the things my dad will sit down with my boys and teach them how to change the brakes or make a dirt bike, or those things I don't know how to do, but I am all for apprenticing and helping this generation keep some of the things, because I'm totally with you. I'm worried and I'm not going to give up. It's part of why I do what I do. So I don't know what else to say about that, but
well, Kristen, I have to say that I agree with you as well. It's just like you're saying with tactical experience, with having, being lucky to have people around you that are older than you that teach you, teach you things that you otherwise wouldn't know. My father and my grandfather, my grandparents, my mother, my aunts and uncles, and even people in this club have taught me so much by being people from an older generation. But I think if I was going to answer that, and I know I wasn't asked the question, but if I was going to answer that, I would say, make sure that you are voting and that you are putting all of everything that you can into education, so that things like health programs, home economics, arts and trades, and so on, the programs where kids can really thrive in ways that they feel comfortable, that they feel like they are thriving, that they feel like they are succeeding, and they feel like they are gaining confidence, that those are programs that are being cut today. And as a 7th and 8th grade teacher, there are things that I worry about as well. So I understand where Mac is coming from in that way. But I also am not scared for the children. I'm not. I have a lot of very, very intelligent, introspective, interpersonal, empathetic children in my life that are my students. And if they had those programs, and if they are not cut, and if state legislation and national as well reflects that, then they are getting the education that they need, especially when it comes to sexual health and so on, and their health programs. That if we are voting in that direction, that is really helpful in making sure that education is funded and that teachers are funded and that these programs are available to them, so that professionals can help them with that if they don't have people in their lives that can, because we know not everybody has a grandparent or a father or a mother that can, teach them how to do simple things. But if education can help them with that, and if we can help fund that, and if we help vote in that direction, then that's the way we need to go. That's how we help our babies. That's how we help our youth.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to pull out that, I get a jaded perspective because I see kids that are struggling. So, right, you see all of them. So they have so many strengths. And because we have therapies and things like that, parents are very much about getting them into therapy. Now, sometimes they want to over therapize them, but, and then art is one of the things that we look for. If a child can draw and fill in details, that tells me that they didn't have developmental gaps.
Right.
That means that they were able to thrive and work on something that doesn't help them stay alive, right? They were
Sure.
able they just had to survive. So we look at those things because those are secondary things, but they're so important. Like music, it builds the neurons in your brain. It literally helps regulate. When I worked at the cancer
Right.
hospital, I know I'm going on forever, but when
No.
we had a mind body department, and we had what's called gong therapy. And literally the theory is that because your body is made up of so much water, that the gong will actually make the liquid in your body do a certain frequency
Vibrate.
vibration.
Right.
Yes. And so it literally physiologically regulates you.
Right.
Wow.
So it was
It's
so
incredible.
cool. Yeah, you would lay on the ground and hear these big gongs, and it would just like be like, "Woo."
Mhm.
Super, super cool. Learned a lot of unique things there. There's a million things that help regulate our kids. So
Yeah.
Well,
thanks.
Kristen, I echo what Emily said. Thank you so much. This has been so beneficial to our club. We recorded it. We have people that could not join us tonight, but what we find is when we post the video, a lot of people will watch it. So that's why we do the recording, just because we want to make sure whatever we were able to talk about, that people can see that. So I'm going to let Kristen go, but one more final thought. Does anybody else have anything before we say goodbye for tonight? Okay.
Goodbye.
Well, Kristen, thank you so much. She'll be sharing the slides with us, and I will forward those on to you. And then, like I said, I'll have the video posted as well.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Laura.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.